My pleasure to be here. I hope you can all hear me. I hope that this isn't keeping you away from your cocktail hour. We'll try and make it as interesting for your time as possible. I'm really delighted to be on this panel with these panelists because they're super smart. As I said, I'll go first. And then Bowman said, well, shouldn't we sit under the picture of ourselves? I thought, that's so smart, so simple. So Bowman Martinez-Reed, thank you for being the only smart one on the panel about that. Extraordinary content creator and actor. Next to him, our very own Ethan Tuxford, who helps me run our Gen Z Lab, which is a global offer talking about Gen Z around the world. And then next to me, Zaria Parvez, who's a senior global social media manager for the extraordinarily successful brand Duolingo. And if any of you were in the Palais yesterday and saw the Duolingo session with about 200 people waiting to try and get in, you can see the passion of the brand, which is fantastic. So last session of the day, everyone I understand has been discussing niches, fandoms, and communities. And we're going to be here talking about one of the most trying, but also one of the most exciting communities, Gen Z. And we've got basically really good perspectives here from the world of brand, creator, our own lab. And basically, we're trying to get across the message that you don't have to answer all the problems of the universe as a brand. You just need to answer the problems of the individual. So we had brand trust data, how do I trust my brand, be launching today. And the biggest shift that we saw in that data was that whereas brands have been challenged to fix societal problems in the last few years, with the state of the world right now, brands are being asked to kind of concentrate on my world. Like, stuff's a bit tough, so can you just kind of concentrate on my world and what I'm doing? So we're moving very much from the sort of macro purpose to sort of micro solutions for me. So 70% of our consumers from this data said that in their personal experience, is basically the thing that influences the most about the brand. So not the tagline, not the marketing, but what actually happens when you experience that brand. Because what we know is that when you speak to everyone, you end up really speaking to no one. So we've got to talk about community today. We're talking about Gen Z. They're not a generation. They're more of a sort of signal. They're not homogenous. But what they do want is transparency, authenticity, and accountability. So let's have a little talk. Fandom, fragility. And what can we win by knowing, I'm clearly not Gen Z, so what can we talk about with the Gen Zers on the panel? 88% of people say trust is equal to price and quality when they choose a brand. This is new. Like, trust is equal to quality and price. So this actually doesn't just change marketing, it actually changes business. So I want to ask each of you, what does trust look like for you? Do you think that because of everything that's going on in the world, it's kind of something that has to happen faster? Do we want more unfiltered truth? Do we want to admit mistakes in public? What's changing if we're saying that trust is now so important? Bowman, do you want to go first?
I would love to go first. Hi, everybody. It's so interesting because the internet moves so fast, and I think that informs how fast our trust is shifting and morphing when it comes to brands. For me personally, I am constantly reevaluating how my audience trusts me and trusts my brand. And I'm also just learning from other creators about like how they can how they build trust with their audience. My good friend Jack Inanan just got cast on a show, Adults, and I saw the other day. Forgive me if this is crazy to say on a panel, but he made a video, and he like threw his phone down and started peeing on it because he got a hate comment about the show, and it was like but that's TikTok. Like that is kind of allowed these days. And I was like, oh my God, like, can I do that? I'm not gonna do that.
Not now.
I'm not gonna do
Not
that.
now.
Definitely not now. I'll wait till after. But it's stuff like that that makes you go like, wow, this is anything kind of goes and anything kind of makes sense on this app where Gen Z kind of reigns supreme. And I think that especially like from our perspective, we are so tired. We grew up with the internet. We grew up in this world of like just constantly being sold things. And now we have the opportunity to like do it our way. And it's quite inspiring to like build that trust ourselves.
I'm scared to give a comment that you won't like now. But I think I agree with that, and I think that when I'm not Gen Z either, so I work with Jackie, but I spend a lot of time talking to Gen Zs across our offices, across Europe, and the thing that you hear the most when it comes to trust is how personal it is. And I think that, especially with brands, people trust brands because they have that personal connection to them. And I think it comes back to the whole overall theme of this talk, which is around niches and communities, because brands need to know and understand those communities and those niches so that they actually can communicate and build that trust even more. Because there is no such thing as mass marketing. There is no such thing as communicating to the mass to succeed. And I think that that's why when we think about trust being so personal, it's so interesting with this generation because you do have to understand the community. You have to talk to them in their way. And that may mean that you do respond quickly, but also means maybe you don't respond as quickly, but you will know that by understanding the audience and understanding what the audience expects from you in return.
Yeah, I think from a brand perspective, when we think about trust, we often go into authenticity and narrative storytelling. But trust is like peeing on your phone, or like trust is like seen in so many different ways. And like for us, for Duolingo, it was self-deprecating humor. Like it was making fun of Duo. We're very well aware that we teach phrases like I am an apple, and you're probably not going to say that when you're traveling somewhere. But what does that mean? What do those silly sentences help represent? And I think understanding that trust isn't what we're always told that brands see trust as, but really it's these different ways to enter these communities in the way that they're talking and speaking their language.
And when we were talking about doing this panel, it was so interesting because you have really changed the way Duolingo markets in a way because of, I'm sure there's no peeing involved, but into this authenticity, you kind of led the way from, it felt like when you were telling the story, perhaps you can just share this, that you had nothing to lose when you first started. And what might have been like a 20% play with TikTok and doing things in a slightly radical way kind of became the 100% play. So do you want to just talk about that kind of little journey a little bit?
Yeah, so the history of Duolingo's TikTok, when we asked our CEO if it was a priority, he said no. And it was kind of like, okay, that's fine. And at the time, like, I really believed in it. I knew the potential of it because I used it. And I was like, all right, if you give me like a $0 budget, that's fine. But if I have my iPhone, this weird crusty owl suit, like, and I come up with a trend that matches it, like, are you guys okay with us posting it? And they're like, yeah, sure, there's nothing to lose. There's really no eyes on us. And then we created that content from a very like authentic place in the sense that like I was creating as if like Duolingo's page was as if I was a content creator on that account. I was not thinking of it as a brand initially, which also like this was my first job out of university, and it was kind of that naivete that I think allowed me to be more free and be less stuck on like strategy. It has to be this way. So we created one of our first videos. It popped off. It went super viral. People loved that we were making fun of ourselves, that we actually understood a trend, and that we were just leaning in a way that brands weren't. And now it feels like a lot of brands are doing that. So that journey of like within 5 years to see that, yes, we were nothing in that sense on social, and now our whole marketing strategy is a social-first brand. And how do we build that out in other countries and regions and really make it part of our DNA?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the trusting that you test, it works, you trust again, you do more. And I think you've kind of talked to the fact of my point at the beginning that mass marketing is dead. Like, you know, understanding your community, understanding the fandom. I think, Bowman, you've done so well. I mean, you should kind of just let people know how well you've done. You've done so well, and your content is kind of surgically tailored to your community, obviously, because you've built your community, so you know your community. Do you have any advice in terms of how brands can kind of get into that micro fluency without looking kind of fake?
Yes. There's nothing worse than when a brand looks fake. And so here's my advice. I feel like I've done a lot of campaigns in my time as a creator. The ones that have worked the best are when the brand comes to me and says, we have this concept, but we want your help to make it make sense. And I feel like what I do on social media and what a lot of creators do on social media is we kind of create our own cinematic universe. I definitely create my own cinematic universe. If you've watched my videos, you see how absolutely absurd it is with the things we do and the things we say, the things we hold in our drinks. None of it makes sense. And for a brand to come in and try to make sense on my page can look very out of place if it's not done in the right way. And so what I try to do is root that brand in the context of my cinematic universe. And like, how does a brand like Aveeno or Mio show up in a Bodashian TV show? Because that's how it should be. It should be, if I'm creating this absurdist world, it's a little bit off-putting when I'm suddenly showing up as Bowman the influencer here to tell you about this new cool thing that I'm doing. Like, obviously that's fun and I will still do that, but it always works best when we find a clever way to do it. At one point, I worked with a drink brand, and as I mentioned before, I don't hold real drinks in my videos. And if I actually at one point, I did a brand partnership, and I sent them the brief, and they came back to me and they said, "Why were you holding a random thing in the video?" And they said this to me IRL in person. And I was like, if I didn't hold a random thing in a video, every comment would be about why isn't he holding a random thing in the video. So it's that serious. But then I made a video where I was holding a drink. I was holding a drink, and the drink brand was in my cup. Like, I put a real drink in the video, but that was the video. It was like production on the Bodashians was halted. The producers took me into the other room. What are you doing? Why are you doing that? And then I explained the drink brand. And so it's stuff like that that like makes sense. And then suddenly I have like 1 million views organically on an ad. And my audience loves it, and I'm proud of it, and now I'm here talking about it. Like, it's stuff like that that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. But you missed out the bit about how successful you are. So you do that next time.
I can talk. Should I talk about it? No, I won't talk.
I guess I'm really interested in knowing about how do you, building on Bowman's point, how do you know how to kind of reach into a niche or a community? So Ethan, what do you have as an example for us of a client where we've done really well at sort of going deep into a community for a client who may well go, well, I'm a mass brand, I need to do mass stuff. Maybe not.
Yeah, and I think it's the understanding of your brand and your heritage and the categories brand, which is so important. One that I love, and it's a little bit self-serving because I do work with them, is Hellmann's. I think Hellmann's have done a brilliant job of actually going into Mayo fans and what the Mayo fan community wants. And a lot of that comes down to just listening to comments on social media, listening to how people use their brand, and going, how do we play into that and how can we do that effectively? And a lot of the campaigns that they create are actually addressing real Mayo problems that are funny. Like, you know, we did a campaign here called the Mayo Exchange, which is all around the fact in the UK that McDonald's, Burger King, all the big fast food restaurants give ketchup for free, but you have to pay for mayo. So we were like, well, why don't we partner with an FX center and trade, like you would trade money, unwanted condiments for mayo? And that was through conversations online. And there are Gen Z who are actively having these conversations, and also not just Gen Z, because these communities do span other generations as well. You can be a mayo lover and also a boomer or a millennial like me. And I think that, but for that to work, it was because they listened and they understood, but they also knew what their place was in the lives of their consumers. And I think that's a really good example of a brand that actually fully understands who their audience is and how to connect with them in a smart way.
Zaria, do you have an example of where you've kind of looked for a community and you've gone deep with them?
Yeah, many. I think, like, kind of stepping back, like, the biggest thing that I always tell other people when taking risks and doing these things with fandoms is, like, most brands are probably maximum 2% of somebody's day. If they really love us, we're like 5%. So people don't really care about us. But the joy of that is that there's a lot of space to experiment because, like, say you do something that flops, no one really cares. So for us, when we go into fandoms, it's a lot of like, all right, like these are fandoms that we see people are engaging with on our social channels. Maybe we don't know anything about them, but let's just like deep dive and go into it and see what's up. So one of them that was really big was Squid Game. So our amazing brand studio team, when season 1 came out, saw that there was an increase in Korean learners when Squid Game came out, but we were too late. Already happened. The promo went on. But we're like, we'll get them next time. So season 2, they were ready, and they actually launched a whole music video and had Duo featured as one of the Pink Soldiers and made all this content around Squid Game because of that insight that we saw an increase in Korean learners, and a lot of people were posting about Squid Game in Korean on our channels. And none of us were like, we watched Squid Game, but none of us were fanatics, but we learned how to speak that language, understand what people were engaging with through Twitter searches, through Reddit searches, and really just deep diving. So I think there's also that comfort that you can become a fan of anything. The internet has a wealth of knowledge, and you can see what they're talking about and really try to engage with them. So I think Squid Game is a great example of that.
Great example. Korean, huh? We're talking about sort of risk and resilience and Gen Z, and what we see from quite a lot of clients is, I'll just keep quiet for a while. I'm a bit unsure about Gen Z giving me a backlash. I'm a bit unsure about the political situation. But we have a really horrible statistic for you, which is that 53% assume that a brand is hiding something if you stay silent. So it's not kind of just paralysis and therefore no harm. It's paralysis and still harm. So, you know, I just want to talk about when silence isn't an option. And I guess, you know, obviously I'm interested in brands not being silent because it's my job. But, you know, to build business, to build brands, especially for where we're talking about in Gen Z, the Gen Z numbers go up. And Gen Z do assume that, you know, well, if you're not actually showing me stuff, it must be bad news. So I just want to sort of touch on this a little bit. And Ethan, we know that one of the tags that came through from the Gen Z data is that Gen Z said, please use your superpower. Can you just explain what they meant by that and what is that superpower?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point because there's the risk of doing it wrong, and I think that we see that a lot of times. I think now when you look at the way that people are responding to cultural movements, I always keep saying this, it's going to feel a bit repetitive, but you've got to bring it back to that authentic place of what is your brand heritage and where do you sit within your category and what do your audience expect? And I think, you know, there was a lot of backlash when everyone was doing the Pride logos and, you know, not then being allies all year round. And I think that that's an example of where maybe brands should have been silent, because if they're not going to be authentic about it, then they shouldn't have responded or shouldn't be doing that. But I think that what they mean when they say use your superpower is it's how you put your marketing spend behind what matters. And we think about when we talk to our brands, consumers see them and go, you have so much reach, you have so much investment, you have so much you can say. And if there's something that's impacting them personally, then they want you to use that channel to do that. And I think that when we're talking to our clients, it's like the idea of staying silent, it's, well, what level of scale are you going to be loud? And how much does it mean to you, and how much are you willing to give back to your community to do more? And that could be a simple post or a simple story, all the way through to actually building a proper campaign and building an ecosystem that highlights an issue that really matters and giving them the acceptance and the understanding that you know and you operate in their world and you care the same way they do.
That's a really good answer. And Zara, you've led in sort of cultural saliency, and as you know, you've gone in there. Have you got sort of some really advice to why you've lent into cultural saliency and helping us not be silent?
Yeah, so I think there's a spectrum of it. So there's being culturally relevant, just to be culturally relevant and with the trends. And then there's also understanding where your place as a brand is, which I know we're all aware of. But I think like one of my favorite examples, which wasn't actually done by my team, but was done by our team in Mexico. Our country marketing manager felt very passionately that she noticed that a lot of people who are using Duolingo for schools don't have access to stable internet in Mexico. And she was convinced, like, we need to do something about this. And we were like, yeah, of course, like, go for it. it went through her cycle. She was thinking about it, and eventually it culminated actually in a partnership with AT&T to help get more Wi-Fi accessibility and like data accessibility to more people in Mexico. You probably didn't see about that. Like, it wasn't the most viral campaign. But then, yeah, we have our cultural moments that are relevant and people are excited about, but that stuff is also happening in the background. And I think having those spaces where if people do digging and if they look deeper and they see what their brand is about, they have those things to point back to. So you kind of get that okay then to be more culturally relevant, to jump into these trends and to be less of like a silent brand because you have all these things to back you up if people go digging.
And you can go wrong with culture. So Bowman, one of the things that we have at Edelman is crisis training, reputation protection, landscaping. Do you think you can do that for culture? Like, what goes on when you decide to link in with stuff or dive into certain aspects of culture? Do you think we can be as ready for kind of... when we were talking about playing, like the internet's a great place to play. You just don't want it to backlash. So have you got some advice?
Play with caution, for sure. Don't pee on your phone. I don't know. It's so hard because you want to be involved with things, but then it's also, as you were saying, like, to what extent do you get involved? And I feel like just as a consumer of the internet, I feel like I've just seen so many times it's like, damned if you do, damned if you don't. And you are constantly like walking into like a dead end sometimes with like the things you talk about, and if you talk about it the right way or the wrong way. I remember 2020, like during the BLM movement. I'm Canadian, for those of you that don't know. I am black, as you can see. But I don't know what it's like to live as a black person in the US. I know what it's like in Canada, but I was learning. I was 21. I had no concept of like what that was like, and I was learning. And then suddenly I was famous too, and I had to talk about it. Like, people were looking to me to be a source of information, and I was kind of just newly wrapping my head around the fact that like I had a following, that people were watching me in the first place. And then I just, from that point on, slowly started to realize like, how can I talk about these subjects in a way that makes sense for me? I'm not someone that can go on Twitter and scream and be angry and hate tweet. Like, I'm just not that type of person. I want somebody to come to my page to feel good. And I remember I made this video about microaggressions that we all face, people in the Black community, and I remember being like, oh, like, I can talk about these issues in a way that makes sense for me. And that's something that I've continued to try and do for the duration of my career. But I think it's just like finding a way to do it that works for you.
And, we see creators basically being like the new media, being our newsrooms. AI is becoming a kind of gatekeeper to that. So you could say, well, actually, who's defining your brand? How do I actually figure that out? And we found that 70% say personal experience shapes their brand perception. 91% of AI users rely on it for shopping research. So that's a huge percentage before they even get to your homepage. But then you've got the line that's happening with Gen Z, that they just don't look up to institutions. They look to you. They look to creators. They look to group chats. They look to niche communities. So with AI, what we've realized is that 90% of the stuff that AI sources comes from earned media. So think what that does to your marketing, not from advertising, from earned media. So it really is a kind of new era of earned, and creators are often the first place that Gen Z are getting information. So given that, search is now basically a sentence into ChatGPT or a swipe through someone's favorites, Zaria, can I ask, how is geo-designing for your own discoverability, given that the whole kind of methodology of this from the tapping is completely changed?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing is, like, for us, we go into new spaces when we know that brands have already saturated. So for us, like TikTok, we launched our TikTok the way it is in September of 2021. There was maybe 3 or 4 brands really killing it then. And then as we saw more brands come, we're like, all right, like this space is getting more saturated. Where are areas that we can jump into? So right now we're working a lot on YouTube Shorts and YouTube Main, and really kind of going, I guess, back to 2016, where we're like, all right, how do we reinvent the wheel in a Gen Z way of how people are streaming and paying attention, and actually like long form. People care about long form, and they do have the attention span beyond what we may think. But also, how do we use a shorts and main strategy to have short form to integrate into the main video? So for us, like YouTube has been a really new space, and because no brands have really owned their stake there yet or have really claimed it as theirs, we think it's just like this hot space for us to experiment with. So that's where we are right now.
That's cool. And who knew it? Everything comes round. And Bowman, how does it feel? Is it kind of scary? Is it responsibility, or is it just fun to know that your content might be the most trusted and first touch point for a brand?
For a brand, it's a little freaky.
Going back to your drink. The drink that was the drink in the glass.
Yes. It's so crazy. I think even just like to be where I am, period, is just so. It's as I was saying at the beginning of this panel, where like the internet moves so fast and so much is changing so rapidly. This whole weekend, I've been talking to people about how I started TikTok to become an actor, and the internet is moving so fast that they're not even making TV anymore. Like we have like ruled out TV as an option, and so now even just for me in my career, I'm having to figure out like, well, what is my goal? Like my goal of like, I have a TV show in Canada, but in the future, what does a TV show even look like? You know, you mentioned YouTube and how YouTube is starting to grow into this like really serious long form space in the industry. And like now I'm having to think about like, oh my God, I have to start making YouTube videos? Like, it's scary. But yeah, I even like for brands to come to me and to trust me with what they want to create and the message that they want to put out there, it's a lot of power. And it's exciting, but it's also fun. I get to show people these brands in a new way. I get to root their brand in my universe. I get to make a Monopoly ad as a Bowmanizer video. And like, what does that look like? And I also think that there's so much room for creativity and to think outside the box. Like, I think that's the most important thing right now, is to think about the partnership content that you're creating in a way that is exciting and innovative, because that's what people want to see. I think people want to see like new, fun things, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this really boring brief.
It's interesting because I think some brands think that they shouldn't be too fun because there's more risk attached to it. But actually, that's where there's less risk, because at least you're authentic. So as my little signaler has signaled that we're at time, Ethan it's kind of got to a point where effectively creators and content almost become like the editor-in-chief for the brand. You obviously sit, thank God, with me on the Gen Z Lab, and we get all kinds of questions. Do you want to just try and wrap up something, given the risk and resilience title of this? Where's the reassurance in playing in this space versus the risk, do you think?
I think the reassurance is in people like Bowen and the creators, and actually having brands lean into that and trust them and their knowledge of their audiences and their channels. I think that is scary for a lot of brands to give that control over, and I think that they do see the risk, but I actually think there's a lot of reassurance in taking those risks. I mean, you see it here at Cannes. The briefs and the campaigns that have done so well were risks and had to take risks, and I think that as the way we consume content changes, it's the people consuming it who we need to be listening to, because they're the ones who are going to keep watching. And if brands try and tell them how to watch, they're not going to do it. So you do need to sort of, a bit like, I get what you've been doing, it's like, have a bit of fun with it and lean into what the creators want, because they are human. And I think that comes back to, what are people looking for? They're looking for human reassurance. They're looking to know that someone like them or someone in their world trusts that brand or likes that brand. So brands need to trust them too.
Well, thank you. That's a brilliant, brilliant way of wrapping up. I would just say that the Gen Z Lab has over 400 Gen Zers around the world, and whenever we ask them to just end on, the sentence I hear the most from them is, just ask us. So with that in mind, thank you for coming up to the villa. Thank you for listening, and have a good rest of Cannes. Thank you.